Hi guys, you're welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be learning how to make a corporate dress. For this dress we'll be using 2 yards of fabric, crepe fabric. Now the first thing I did was to fold the fabric with the fullest part of the measurement, which is the hip. So the hip I'm working with is 44, so I folded with that 44 and then I added 2 inches. The next thing is to minus the half length, which was 17.5, so I placed my tape at 17.5, then I cut my skirt. So the first thing I marked here was the hip line. You could measure it or just come down with 10 inches from the top. So that's the hip line. Then the next thing is to mark the length of the skirt. This is the easiest way to cut the skirt, guys. So I marked the length of the skirt, which was 47. Now this is me marking the waist measurement divided by 4. I marked the waist measurement divided by 4, and then I added just 1 inch allowance. The hip also divided by 4, and then I added 1 inch allowance. 1 inch because it's a stretchy fabric, you don't need so much allowance on it. So this is me just connecting. And now for the hem, I'm going to minus 2 from the hip divided by 4. So the hip divided by 4 was 11, minus 2 gave me 9. So I want it to be a bit fitted underneath since it's a pencil gown. So I marked it on the hemline and then I connected with my ruler. Now I also added 1 inch for the hem allowance before I cut. So this is me just cutting it out. Now after cutting it out, I proceeded to make another fold on the fabric like this to cut the back part. So I just placed the front that I cut out on it. Then you can see that I actually removed 1 inch for the zipper allowance. It's a stretchy fabric, like I said, you don't need too much. And also I didn't do any contouring on the zipper allowance because the fabric is really stretchy. So I just, cut it out like this, and then I cut open that part of the zipper allowance to enable us fix the zip there. So this is all for the skirt. We're going to just notch that zipper allowance and then the midpoint so it can be easy for us to join. The next thing is to draft out the upper part of this style of this corporate dress. So that's what I'm doing here. Now I just took my paper. The first thing I did was to mark my bust point. Place your paper at the top, mark your bust point, which was 11. After my bust point, I marked my under bust, which was 14, and then the next was the half length, which is 17.5. After marking these, guys, just make a straight rule to connect everything, which is what I am doing now. So guys, the next thing is to get our armhole depth. I'm using the formula bust divided by 6 plus 1.5 or 2. I'm working with bust 40 divided by 6 plus 1.5 or 2. So that's 6.7 plus 1.5, either 8 or 8.5, depending on what you added to it. So I added 1.5, that's 8. So I'm adding 1 to that 8 for the shoulder slant. So I'm marking 9 inches for the armhole depth. That's 8 plus 1 inch. So I'm just making that connection for the armhole depth. Now the next thing we want to mark is your shoulder. You divide the shoulder measurement by 2. The shoulder I'm working with was 16, divided by 2 gave me 8. So I'm marking the 8 at the top and then at that armhole line. So after marking it, just make a straight connection like what I'm doing now. Just make a straight connection. Then that 1 inch that you added to your armhole, mark it, come down by 1 inch. That's for your shoulder slant, like I mentioned earlier, and connect to the top of the paper like this. Now after making this connection, the next thing we want to do is to get our armhole curve. Because we want to remove the excesses at that armhole part, we will divide our armhole line by 2, just like what I'm doing, divided by 2, and then you come in by half of an inch. So you can have a perfect curve. Now I'm just proceeding to mark all my round measurements. My bust divided by 4 plus 1 inch allowance, and then my waist divided by 4 plus 1 inch allowance. So this is what I just marked here, and then I made a connection like this. Now the next thing is to make that connection on your armhole. That place you went in by half of an inch, just place your curve rule and connect like this. It's very easy, guys. So now we're marking our neck width and our neck depth. The neck width I used was 3 inches. The neck depth is 3.5. So just mark it like this and make a straight connection. Now the reason for making this straight connection is so you'll be able to have a perfect neckline curve at that part. So after making that straight connection, I just grab my curve rule and then I connect it easily to give that perfect neckline. So after doing this, the next thing we want to do is to mark our dart. Now to get the dart line, I'm going to use my nipple to nipple divided by 2. I'm working with a nipple to nipple of 8 inches. Divided by 2 is 4. So I mark it on the half length, the under bust, and then on the bust point. So I just labeled all my lines so that you guys can easily see what is there. So on that part of the bust point, I came down by 1 inch. That's if you want to sew this dart on the dress. So this is just a basic bodice pattern I'm just showing you guys, but I wouldn't want a dart on this dress. So you're just going to see how I'm going to alter this dart. Now I put that 1 inch for the dart on the allowance parts, because after sewing that dart or closing the dart, you are going to have to put that allowance. So now we're going to go to the back pattern. So the first thing for the back pattern is to mark your half length and your armhole line. Remember, our armhole line was 8 inches plus 1 inch for the shoulder slant. So after marking, I'm just making a connection with a straight line. Now the next thing for the back is to remove the 1 inch for the zipper allowance, which is what I am doing here. Remember, I just used 1 inch for the skirt, so I'm also using 1 inch for the upper part, and then I made a straight line connection. Now that line is going to be where you are going to start all your measurements from, that zipper allowance line. So I marked my shoulder 16 divided by 2, which is 8 inches on the top and on the armhole line, and then I made a connection. I came down by 1 inch for the shoulder slant and I connected it back to the top at the opposite side. The next thing, guys, is to mark my bust divided by 4, which was 40, 10. Divided by 4 was 10, then I added 1 inch for allowance. For the waistline also, waist divided by 4 plus 1 inch allowance, and then I made a connection. Now the next thing I did here was to mark that same dart line, which was nipple to nipple divided by 2. That's 8 divided by 2, that is 4. And then for the dart intake is 1 inch, half inch on one side and half inch on the other side. And then I connected. I didn't come down by 1 inch here. I connected directly to the armhole line. That's how you do your back dart. Then I added the 1 inch of the dart and then I connected it. Now for the armhole curve, divided the armhole line by 2 and I went in by 2/8. That's half of an inch. Now I just made a connection with my armhole curve. Now for the neckline, the same thing. For the width, I went in by 3 inches. Then for the depth, because the front of this dress, the depth is already high, so the back should be low. So I came down by 6 inches. Yeah. Now I made a straight line connection, like I said, so that we can have a perfect curve. And then I grabbed my curve rule and then I made the curve with it. So the next thing I want to do is to create a bust dart. Now to create your bust dart, from your bust point, you're going to come down by 1 inch, right? Come down by 1 inch, and then from that your bust point, that place that you came in by 4 inch, you are going to go in again by 1 inch, because if you want to sew a bust dart, you do not want it too pointy except you are transferring the dart. So you go in by 1 inch and then you make a slant connection like you see me do. Now that 1 inch you came down by this side, you divide it by 2, that's half inch. So now that midpoint, you just connect it to that point you went in by 1 inch. Connect it just like you see me do. It's very easy, guys. Now after doing this, the next thing we want to do is that we want to take that 1 inch to the back, because by the time you sew that dart, the both sides will not align. That's the back will not align with the front. So you have to go up by 1 inch for the end of that your back pattern, just like you see me do. Go up by 1 inch and connect it to one of the dart legs. It's very easy, guys. Connect it to one of the dart legs, pass through the dart legs actually. Now after doing this, you're going to understand better. I'm just going to cut it out because I want to actually do a dart transfer. I do not want this waist dart. I don't like waist dart on my corporate dresses. So the midpoint of your waist dart, just cut it open. Now we're going to cut it to your bust point, because if you are doing a dart transfer, you don't need to come down by 1 inch or go in by 1 inch. You have to cut it directly into that your bust point line. So that's what I did. Then you're also going to cut open your bust dart down to that your bust point line, but I'm going to use a masking tape so I don't cut it entirely. So you just cut it through to that point, cut it to that point actually. Now, after cutting it to that point, look at what I'm doing. I want to close this waist dart because I do not want to sew it on my dress. So I close the waist dart so that I'll be able to open the bust dart. It's just the bust that I want on this dress. So I'm closing it now because I want to cut it out. You have to close it to be able to cut the side of your pattern. So, you know, by marking this dart, those sides are not aligning again. So I closed it so that I can be able to connect it to give that straight line there. So it will not be like incomplete. So I closed it first and then I connected the line. This will enable me to cut it perfectly well. Now this is me just cutting this front pattern. Just watch what I'm going to do, guys. I told you I do not want the waist dart on this dress. That's why I closed it so that I can open the bust dart. So I'm just cutting this open first of all, and then I also went ahead to cut the back pattern. I cut the back pattern out. So now I'm showing you guys the sides, why I went up by that 1 inch. You see that when closing that bust dart, the sides do not align anymore. That's why I went up by that 1 inch, right? So this is me just trimming out that 1 inch part, and then you can see that the both sides are aligning now. So when I sew that bust dart, I will not be having unequal sides. So now I'm opening the bust dart to show you guys that okay, it's the bust dart I'm going to sew. The waist dart will remain closed like that. So I'm just cutting it open. Those half inch, I'm just cutting it open because that's how I need fabric underneath this place so that I can sew in a dart. So the next thing we want to do is to cut out the flay that is at that half length of the dress. So because it's going to just be at the front part, you're going to divide your waist measurement by 2 before you divide by 6.28, which is the formula for getting the circumference for your flay. Now, because I want to cut both the flay and the lining together, I'm just going to work with my waist circumference, my entire waist circumference divided by 6.28 so that I can cut it double. So the first thing is to fold your fabric in 2, and then you fold your fabric again. That's you're folding into 4. First of all, fold it into 2, and then you fold it into 4 like this. Now you can mark the whole length of both the circumference and the length of the flay to be able to manage the fabric while folding, or you can just go ahead to fold. So I folded into 4. Now the thing that you have to do is that, like I said, I want to cut both the lining and everything together, so that's why I'm using my entire waist circumference. So my waist divided by 6.28 is what I got, but you need to add about 1 or 2 inches to it because there's an overlap in the flay. Actually, that part of the waist, there's going to be like an overlap. So that's why you're going to add to your waist measurement. So if your waist was like 30, just make it like 32 or 33 before you divide, so that you can have access to be able to flip it over. Now after marking your circumference, just watch out what I'm doing. I'm going to mark my length. Now the length I'm using, I do not want it to be very long, so I'm using just 9 inches for the length of the flay. So just connect it, and then after connecting, you go ahead to cut it out. Now this is what I'm doing now. I'm cutting it out. Like I said, I am going to use this entire portion that I cut for both the flay and its lining. That's why I used my entire waist circumference. But if you want to cut your lining separately, you can just divide your waist by 2 before dividing by 6.28, right? So this is what I'm doing. I'm just notching that midpoint. Now, if you look at the flay, it's not actually straight. It actually has like a slant at that midpoint. Before you flip it over, it actually has like a slant. So just get the midpoint. That's why I notched it. I got the midpoint. Now, after getting the midpoint, just draw a straight line like I did and go out from both sides by 2 inches. That's you're going in now by 2 inches on both sides, going by 2 inches, and connect to the top part, that midpoint, just like what I'm doing here. Connect it. Now after making this connection, just use your scissors to cut it out. Yeah, just cut it out. Now we don't want it to be straight. We want to have that slant look. That's why I got the midpoint and I went in by 2 inches on both sides. Now this is how I divided my flay. So the next thing that I want to do is that from that end part of the flay, look at what I'm doing. Just go up by 2 inches because that place actually has a kind of a curve. It's not straight. So you just go up by 2 inches and curve with your curve rule, or you can also use your free hand to just curve it in. Now after curving it in, just take your scissors and cut it out like what I'm doing here. So after cutting it out like this is how it's going to look like. And now this is the flip I was talking about. So that's why you need to add to your waist measurement before getting the circumference so that you can flip it over. Now the next thing we want to do, let's proceed to cut out our front part, that's the upper part. We have already drafted the pattern a while ago, so this is me just placing it to cut out. Now look at that portion of the bust dart. That's the fabric that I'm going to sew in as the dart. So I'm just pinning down this pattern to the fabric, and then I am cutting it out like this. So after I was done cutting, I'm just going to make a notch at this part of the dart so that I can easily sew in my dart. So I make a notch at one end to the other end of the dart like you see me doing. Now this is how I'm just going to take it up and sew on my machine. Now the next thing I want to do, I want to cut for the back also. I place the pattern on the fabric and then I pin it down, I pin it all over, and then I cut out. So guys, after I was done cutting, I went ahead to notch the part for my dart just like I did in the front, and then I finished up the trimming and removing all the excesses. Now the next thing that you want to do is to open up the zipper allowance part also, and also make a notch at that point of the zipper allowance so you know where to fix your zip, which is 1 inch actually. So now at this point you can go ahead to cut your sleeve. Just take the circumference of your armhole, which is what I'm doing, and go ahead to cut it. So I did that off camera. What I'm going to do now is to cut the facing for this dress. So I'm going to use the same fabric for the facing. First of all, from the neck depth, you are going to come down by 4 inches, and then from that point of the shoulder, you are going to go in by 2 inches. Go in by 2 inches from the shoulder, from the neck depth, come down by 4 inches, and then just mark out that's your neck circumference, or just cut it out like I'm doing. Now I'm going to cut out this part. Look at what I'm doing here. It's very easy. I'm cutting it out, and then I'm just going to remove the pattern and then connect from that 2 inches and that 4 inches on the neck depth and that 2 inches on the shoulder. Just make that connection. This is how your facing is going to be. It's just going to be short and it will be perfect for the dress. So I'm just cutting it out like you're seeing me doing. I'm just cutting it out, and then after doing for the front, I'm going to go ahead for the back, and it's still the same thing that we'll be doing for the back. So guys, after I was done cutting everything, we're just going to proceed to sew. First of all, we're going to sew out the darts for the back. So here I've made all the darts, I've sewn all the darts, and then I've sewn the facing. Now I want you guys to notice the way I sewed this facing. I did not sew it to the zipper part. So that 1 inch of the zip, that's where I ended my sewing of this facing. Just take a look at it. You can see that I ended it at that part of that 1 inch, because we want to do a neat finishing of the zipper, finishing of the zipper part. So that's why I ended my sewing there. And this is for the upper part. You can see I've sewn my bust dart and then the facing for the front of the dress. Now look at how the bust dart is neatly sewn on it. So it is that thing that you marked on your pattern that you're going to sew. Look at how it looks inside. Look at how it looks like inside. Now the next thing is for us to finish up our flay before we join it to the skirt part. Now I'm just cutting it open. Like I said, I cut it double already by using the entire waist circumference, so we have both the lining and the main part. So I'm just cutting it open like this. And then the next thing I did was to iron an interfacing on one of the parts of the flay, that's on the lining part. I used a gum stay for it, and then I went ahead to sew on 1/2 inch round. So after I was done, I turned it over and then I placed it on the front part of the skirt like you see me do. Actually, you give it a good press, then you place it down. Make sure you pin down. So I flipped about 1 inch for that upper part. Look at what I did here. I flipped about 1 inch and I proceeded to my machine to sew it down. So after I was done, I brought the upper part. Now I'm going to join both at that half length. I'm going to join both front to front, then making sure the midpoints are aligning. Then I go and I sew on my machine on 1/2 inch. So after I was done sewing, this is how it looks like. It's really beautiful, guys, and it's easy to make. So the next thing was to do for the back. So guys, for our dart, we're just going to go in for the back dart by your nipple to nipple divided by 2, which is 4. And then for the dart leg, you're just going to use 6 inches for the length of your dart leg. Now the way you did for your back dart, for the upper part, the same thing, use 1 inch for the dart, that's ½ inch on both sides. Now after I was done sewing the dart, I just brought the upper part and the skirt part together and I joined it using ½ inch. Make sure the 2 dart legs are aligning, and then you go to your ironing table and give it a good press. So we're going to proceed to join the shoulder. Now you're not going to join the shoulder the normal way. You're going to take the front part of the dress to the back of the dress, that's the front facing each other. Now you're going to take one part of the lining, that's one part of the facing, and you're going to turn it over to sew on ½ inch round. So you either take for the back or you take for the front. So yeah, I took for the front, and then after I flipped it over, I'm just going to sew on ½ inch. So after I was done sewing, this is how it looks like. It's so neat, guys, and the flip side will look like this. So you just go ahead to weave the inside of the dress. Now I went ahead to join my sleeve. If you want to see a video on how I cut this sleeve, you can check my channel. I have a sleeve tutorial there. So I actually finished up the hem of this sleeve with an hemming gum. Like I used hemming gum to iron it in so that I won't have a sewing line outside. Now the next thing I did was to mark out my measurements, but if you do not want to mark out your measurements, you already know the allowance that you put, which was 1 inch, so you can just go ahead to just sew close the dress using 1 inch. But because of this tutorial, I'm just showing you guys that even after marking my measurements, my bust, my waist and my hip, I still ended up having 1 inch as the allowance. So you can as well go ahead to just sew on that 1 inch round to close your dress. Now the next thing we did is to finish up the dress by fixing the zipper. Now remember this part I told you that I ended my facing, so we're going to sew the zip in first without that facing, then we're going to cover it up with the facing. So this is me just pinning down my zip first of all before I head to the machine to sew it in. Now after I was done sewing the zipper, I will just close that down part and then make a slit there. Now to finish up the zipper neatly, just open up that place that you used in sewing the facing. So I had already ironed hemming gum there, so I was just opening it up. And now this is what you're going to do. You're going to finish that ½ inch you were using to sew that neckline, and then you're going to sew it down. Just watch what I'm doing here on the machine. So I'll close it up with the facing. I'm going to close it up with the facing like that, and then I'm going to continue that sewing line that I used to sew in the facing to the back neckline. So I'm just going to continue that sewing. I'm going to sew it down to where the zipper ends, right, where that point, that part of the zipper ends, not the entire zipper, right? Just look at what I'm doing. I'll sew to that point where the zipper ends, and then I'll bring down my needle and then I turn it over and sew this straight line just directly after the zipper, So I'm still sewing on top of the zip, but not on that rough part of the zip, right? So I just sew it straight down, and after I was done sewing straight down, I'm just going to trim off this excess of the zip, and then when I turn it over, guys, this is how it's going to look like. It's going to look very, very, very neat. It's going to look very, very neat like this. So I'm just going to repeat this process for the other part of the zipper. So I was done with it, and now this is the finished look of your zipper. Instead of flipping your zip over and then making it look rough, it can actually look neat like this. So what you just do is just go ahead to weave the facing inside. So after I was done with this zipper part, the next thing I did was to finish up the zipper. That's after the zip ends, that part of the slit. So I basically just continued that sewing line down to like 5 inches before the hem of the dress, and that was what served as my slit. So you can actually go ahead to finish up the hem of your gown by either folding it in, that 1 inch allowance we put for the hem, or you just weave it and then iron with your hemming gum to make it more neat. So guys, this is the end of today's tutorial. If you found this helpful, please don't forget to like, subscribe and leave a comment. Bye.